Good morning, everyone. We'd like to begin today's panel discussion with a traditional land acknowledgement for the city of Swift Current, and that's where I'm sitting here today. Swift Current, Saskatchewan is located within Treaty 4 territory, and we acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of many First Nations peoples, including the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and we acknowledge that it's the homelands of the Métis Nation. I'd also like to extend this respect to all the Indigenous peoples across North America and the traditional lands in which we live and work today. Good morning again. My name is Dallas Philippon. I'm your moderator for the day. I'm also the technical lead for spill response at Matrix Solutions. I've spent 17 years in emergency response, mostly in oil and gas related capacity. And for those who don't already know, Matrix Solutions is now part of Montrose Environmental Group. So some housekeeping for the webinar today. The panel discussion will be about 40 minutes and we'll leave time for questions at the end. If you have a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if you hover over top of it, it'll light up. You can click on it and enter your question. And we'll reserve those for the very end. And I see Margot just typed something in the chat there. So, or in the questions, just to test it out. So it's working. All right. Yeah, we'll try to get to all the questions at the end of the panel discussion. And if there are extras that we're not able to get to, we will follow up afterwards. And we'll also share this presentation with or by email after the discussion. And yeah, with that, I think we'll begin. So throughout our day-to-day operations, we go to great lengths to protect the public, property, and environment. And you see this happening right from the environmental permitting and engineering design phase, and this carries out into the construction operations phase. And that said, despite our greatest efforts to reduce the likelihood and severity of incidents, many of us have experienced an emergency at some point in time. Montrose Environmental Group has extensive experience in emergency management and preparedness, and we believe in the importance of discussing these strategies to improve everyone's chances of getting it right when the stakes are heightened. With that, I want to introduce our panel of experts, and that will include James, April, Scott, and Rick, as you see on the screen. And I'll call on each of you to provide a quick introduction and also describe your connection to the emergency response and preparedness industry. And we'll start with James.
All right. Thanks, Dallas. My name is James McCormack. I started my consulting career in 2002 and quickly found myself jumping headlong into things like train derailments, pipeline releases, plant fires, etc. I would say conservatively, over the course of my career, I've responded to over 100 incidents in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I spent 18 years at CTEH and held a variety of roles there: Director of Environmental Services, Senior Emergency Response Consultant, and in 2022 transitioned into a role at Montrose when we were acquired. I presently lead the oil and gas sector for Montrose and continue to support our oil and gas customers on their emergency preparedness and response needs. And very much looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you for having me on. And April, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, James. I'm April Steger. I've been with CTEH, now a Montrose Environmental Group company, since 2008. I've also held several different roles, several environmental scientist roles, including environmental scientist project manager. So I led a team who would respond to chemical incidents, mostly across the US, some in Canada, anything that was impacting people. So you kind of think outside the fence line. Community monitoring has always been kind of my go-to specialty, implementing industrial hygiene processes during an emergency response. And in 2012, I moved to Houston, Texas, where I sit today, and I now lead business development for CTEH. So I have a team. We do a lot on the preparedness side, a lot of exercise support and drills for clients today. And Scott, I'll pass it to you.
Perfect. Thanks, April. Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Purves. I started my career with Matrix back in 2000. Through that time, I've held various roles, but the one thing that's been consistent is supporting clients through spill response, emergency response type events. So I'm currently the technical director for assessment, remediation, and reclamation. And within that, that's where we house our spill response and emergency response services as well. So I've been involved in all sorts of terrestrial events, small to quite large, and everything around water from ephemeral draws all the way up to major rivers, including a lot of wetlands, bogs, fens. Yeah, so it's been unique. It's always exciting. And I'm excited to talk about it today with everyone, just around strategies to make that easier and less stressful. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rick.
Hi, everybody. My name's Rick Wenning. I lead the Montrose Ecosystem Economics Group from here in coastal Maine, where I'm talking to you. I'm an ecotoxicologist by training. My career, which I think is longer than the folks here, is always focused on chemical behavior in the environment. Toxic effects on wildlife, what happens in issues around bioaccumulation, biomagnification through food chains. Damage assessment is my primary focus. So I'm thinking about the issues surrounding what happens in the environment after an accident and what might be the most efficient way to restore a damaged ecosystem. I've had the luxury of working on all sorts of issues in the US, in Canada, and around the world. I look forward to this discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's great. Yeah, so when we experience an emergency, we'd like the response to be as smooth and painless as possible. And so I'd like to start with discussing what strategies do the most prepared companies set up to ensure that they can effectively respond when an emergency arises. And maybe April can kick us off with that one.
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to. So I think the most prepared companies do a lot to engage with the response partners. So you need to know who your response partners are, know how to activate these partners. And this extends, beyond your internal organizations, which really looking outward at what consultants are going to step in and you're going to rely on when it may be your worst day. We've got to make sure that the contracts are up to date. You have the correct phone numbers and the right activation schedule in your response plans. And I think probably the most important aspect to all of this is to practice with the folks that you're going to rely on, at least annually, conduct a drill and really plug in so that everybody understands the expectations. What's the expectations of CTH when we show up to a response? That's the questions that are able to be answered during those drills and exercises.
Thanks, April. Yeah, the contract side is definitely something that maybe isn't always, especially when you have a long linear project where you might have multiple different types of contractors along that route. Yeah, is there any other thoughts that come to mind?
I would just add in real quickly the idea of practicing is really important. Wayne Gretzky didn't practice on roller skates all day long and then try to play that night on his ice skates. So practice like you play. Bring in the people that you would expect to respond with to your scenarios that you're going to exercise. But what you're really trying to do is test your plans. Get your plans out. And it's remarkable the number of times we encounter a company that has a plan on a shelf. They've never taken it out. They've never looked at it. They've never confirmed the phone numbers. Just all sorts of things change. We're in a dynamic life here. Things are changing all the time. So take your plans out, test them, and then find ways to improve those plans, right? Those are the purpose. Those are opportunities for improvement. Every time you get out and exercise, you go, boy, we need to change that. We need to add these people. We hadn't even considered that. And so those are some of the things that I would add to what April mentioned.
Yeah, let me jump in too, James and April. In addition to preparedness and practice, think about the materials you're handling. Think about the operation that you're concerned about. From an effects and an impact perspective that I have, understanding how those materials that might be accidentally released to the environment behave, fundamental principles. If you're in transportation, of course, and you're involved in handling materials long distances and from place to place, it's hard to characterize the environment at every location. But I think, Scott, I think you would agree, you have a good idea, at least, of some of the fundamental environmental characteristics, how you might expect that material to behave in the environment. Those are important parts of your preparedness and planning process.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, understanding your local setting is critically important. And to April's point about knowing your partners, we'll get those phone calls from time to time from our clients. And, I'm sure we have a lot of Western Canadian clients on this call. Everybody knows resources are tight. There's only so many people available right now. So giving those vendors a call and saying, hey, if we had an event, will you have people? Will you be there for us? Having those conversations is really important on some sort of regular frequency.
Yeah, and you can test out your vendors as well during the emergency response. I know I've been called on occasion from our clients saying, "Hey, this is just a drill. If there was something hypothetically to happen today, would you be able to respond? And if so, how long would it take you to get there?" So yeah, that kind of rolls nicely into what's critical to get right in the aftermath of an incident. Maybe could you elaborate on some of the key lessons learned over the years? Just on incident happens and what do we need to get right off the hop? And I don't know, perhaps James or April?
Well, I mean, I'm going to actually ask April to kick us off because her focus in her response career has really been focusing on the protection of people, and then let her talk about that. And then I will focus a little bit on the protection of the environment side, which is where I mostly reside.
Yeah, so really the first objective of every single response is to protect people. So it's life safety. And one of the very first concerns is the air safe to breathe? So getting the air monitoring implemented as quickly as possible, whether that's a team that you've built in-house to kind of reduce that gap while your contractors are mobilizing to the scene. But at the same time, you can do a lot for a response, but until you get that communication right and institute, some sort of media statement, that's going to be super important, because you can be doing all the things correct for life safety or like James going to talk about for the environment. But unless you're sharing that publicly and really emphasizing it through places like social media, where people love to get fast information, then it's really going to set the tone that you're not doing what you should be doing for people and the environment. So I would say, get the air monitoring going as quick as possible so that we can tell people that it's safe. And if it's truly not, then we, do some evacuations or shelters in place of the public, but then start sharing information as fast as you can.
And I'll follow up with the real quickly, when we talk about life safety as the number one priority, it absolutely is. And it's the well-being and life safety of your employees, the responders who you've mobilized to get there, and it's the community in which you operate. And so, that question of whether the air is safe to breathe is critical to all those people. And a lot of people defer to, we've got air monitoring being done by local fire departments. The air monitoring they might be performing, it may be related to LEL and explosive conditions, but not necessarily the chemical concentrations in the air. So, April talking about the criticality of putting air monitoring out first and foremost is super critical. On the environmental side, there's a lot that we can do up front. We want to assess the impact, right? It's visually getting people out into the field, provided we can do it safely, and really assess how much, we're delineating where it's going, how much is out there. and then identifying resources at risk. First and foremost, Rick is going to talk a lot about some of the protection of those sorts of resources. But on the front end of a response, we want to identify things that are critical, threatened and endangered species. It could be infrastructure things like drinking water intakes, right? We want to make sure that we are identifying those. Just like on the air side, we would identify sensitive receptors, hospitals and things like that. On the environmental side, we want to do the same thing and identify, threatened and endangered species, critical things. So again, it's our resources at risk. That becomes really critical at the front end of a response.
Yeah. Hey, April, can I ask you something too? In these early days, in the early moments, I should say, how about leadership? I can imagine I've been to several instances. A lot of times you're bringing strangers together, or whether it's for all sorts of folks together. How do you get the lay of the land in terms of coordinating communications and what actions when everybody wants to help? I suppose you have to have a little bit of a chain of command structure in place. Is that right?
Yeah, so we would operate under ICS structure for emergency events. We often fit air monitoring into a safety role. So they're more field safety personnel that are collecting that air monitoring data. And then for us, we have a project manager who is going to be that one source for client communication. We'll have a toxicologist assigned to every project that's making sure that the instruments that we've picked are correct for the chemicals of concern. And then we have our field scientists who are collecting that data that's funneling through the project manager and into a command post so that those decisions can be made. But yes, you're right. ICS is super important when you have that many people that need to communicate critical information.
Yeah.
And I'll say too that, we talk a lot about collecting data and where we might have chemicals of concern, but collecting the zeros are just as important. The upwind data, the 360 degrees around, a fixed facility that might be having an upset. Collecting zeros will go a long way to really help delineate where the extent of the contamination may have been.
Yeah, we often forget about the background data collection, don't we? What's there, what was there before everything started. Speaking of data, during a response, you got logistics to worry about. You got contractors coming in and out. You got your scientists coming onto site collecting data, and just a huge, vast amount of data being collected, and it needs to be managed and analyzed. Can we speak to the flow and maybe the pitfalls or strategies for managing that bulk of data so that it can be used effectively by the response team?
Yeah, I can definitely. I could talk about data all day if you let me. So, to April's point about communication and trying to get that communication out as quickly as possible, and in today's world with social media, a story will develop no matter what is out there. So the quicker you can actually get real data out to the various stakeholders involved, the better. So really, as a company that may have an event, you want to be sure that either you're comfortable that you can manage all that data, or that you've got a vendor that can step in and play that role for you. Because really what you want to try to achieve is get a single source of truth where you've got all your data flowing in. Because until you get that established, there's going to be a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety in the ICS command center around decision making, around communication, until they get that data that they can rely on, that's defensible, that's been collected properly. So most of the big events that I've been involved in, that's where most of the stress actually comes from, is getting that data flowing. And once you fix data flows, you can then establish communication flows. So it's really critically important. So, that would be some of my advice to anyone that may have to deal with an event like this. Make sure you understand whether you can handle that data flow or whether you've got a vendor in your network that can support you with that data flow, because it is really critical to have timely information flowing into that ICS command center so that the proper decisions can be made. And you've only got so many resources as well, so you really have to be able to decide what data is critical, what are we going to collect, what don't we have the resources to collect. So you have to be able to prioritize what you're going to collect, because you can, in a big event over several months, you can have millions of data points for various mediums: air, sediment, wildlife data, soil and groundwater, vegetation impacts. There's all sorts of things that are going to come in and flow into your decision making and your communication streams through that platform. So to me, it's foundational.
Yeah, and I would just say and add to it real quickly, if the first priority of any response is the protection of people, and the second priority is the protection of the environment, it's really hard to demonstrate that you're protecting people or protecting the environment if you're not collecting a ton of data in a way that can be easily actionable within the command post, reproducible by your agency partners or others that may be also collecting data, and then legally defensible, right? So there's a whole host of challenges with getting good data because we talked a little bit earlier about if you're not telling the story, if you're not communicating, I promise you someone else is. And so somebody else, whether it's, the public says, well, I've collected data in my yard and this is what it looks like. And so there's, we want to make sure that we're ahead of that in terms of properly managing that data and reporting it out at a time frame that allows the public to be comfortable with everything that we're doing. Because most companies do the right thing. They're just not as good at communicating how well that they've done up front. So, great point, Scott.
Yeah. Thanks, James and Scott. So yeah, we talked about communication several times as well. And yeah, that's absolutely critical to get communication right. And there's also not only with each other, with our field, our response team, with our clients and our stakeholders and the public. There's just so many different mediums of communication as well, just like there's many mediums of data. What are the best practices that we've seen to support that vital flow of information, and kind of also, I guess we need to get ahead of the social media scene as well. So maybe, I don't know who would like to take that one. James, maybe do you want to go on the
I could start, but
or April maybe would be the initial responder a lot of times. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that a lot of organizations may start with a website, a dark website that they can just turn on for the event. But we talked about it earlier in terms of, Scott mentioned that single source of truth. It's got to be the place where all the communication is going to be coming from. If we're going to be putting something up on a website, it's got to be the truth, because we're all going to be talking the same, whether it's our public information officer or the Joint Information Center or whoever's speaking on behalf of the response of the responsible party. Truthfully, we want to make sure that is accurate. But a lot of companies I see as a best management practice have a dark web, but that they could turn on a website that becomes, and they just name it the name of the incident, and that's where all the information will go. April, you want to talk about some of the other ways we do town halls and things like that when we're dealing with people and trying to get back into their homes, for example, and how we might communicate to people individually?
Yeah, I think the biggest struggle is making sure everyone has the same story. So you really rely in ICS, you really rely on something like your situation unit to be the truth. How much boom has been placed in the field? How many dead fish do we have? They not only the actual sampling data information, but just the general everything added together. The situation unit is supposed to be the truth of the response. But I also like the idea of the dark web. So yeah, it's a website that you never use until you have an incident, and there you can create messaging. You can pull in also from the back end any social media that's being fed so that you have your PO can address things as their concerns from the public that they're reporting on. But when it comes to data, particularly data for environmental sampling data or air monitoring data, people are really implementing data management plans. So, just like any other sampling plan or strategy, they're putting together a data management unit and a data management plan where it talks about information flow and where data is going to be stored, how is it QC'd. And remember that the data that we're collecting, all of this information has to be stored forever. So you have to be, not just sure that your contractor can keep up with it right now during the response, but be able to, capture everything that's being collected and forever store it as evidence of what happened during the response. Did I answer the question there?
Yeah, I like how you brought in the ICS component as well, because I know from experience being in the field, there's a lot of leaders out in the field as well, and as an initial or as a responder, boots on the ground, sometimes you're getting two different conflicting instructions, or maybe they're not conflicting, but the priority level is a little bit different. And so you think you're doing the right thing as a responder in the field, and then the next person, asks the question, what are you doing? Well, this person told me to do it. And anyway, so ICS really helps to keep things tight in the field.
Yeah, Dallas, and maybe just I'll add a couple more pieces to that, because April made a really good point, and I do think our clients generally have really good plans around protecting human health. In Western Canada, we maybe don't do the same amount of air monitoring that that our peers do in the US, just with the population densities. But I think where I see a lot of challenges is once we say, okay, human health is not an issue, people are protected.
Oh, we lost your audio there, Scott.
Can you hear me, Dallas?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I'm not sure what happened. It didn't go on mute, but we lost you for a second. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I was just saying, once we move from a human health protection event and we're comfortable that human health is protected, and we move to an environmental ecological focused response, that's where I see that clients may not have a lot of those environmentally ecologically focused plans ready to go. And so having some templated plans in your emergency response bucket as well is really helpful, because yes, human health may not be an issue any longer, but this event can still drag on for quite some time and cost a lot of money if you don't have an idea of what those plans may need to be for that event. So wildlife mitigation, soil sampling, water sampling, vegetation recovery, all of these various data sets that you're going to need. And, I think Rick's probably got a lot more experience in the back end of putting dollar amounts to some of those issues. But, James and I talk about this a lot. That's where you can see an event really drag on for a very long period of time if you don't do the right amount of data collection up front for some of those ecologically focused items.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll jump in, Scott. And it's purposeful that I've been a little quiet here on this particular discussion, because as someone who's really involved in effects assessment, damage assessment, and thinking about restoration as we begin to contain, control, and clean up an incident, that's when I start to get more involved. These kinds of situations, these accidents, these crises we talk about, they do have an evolution, and there are stages where the priorities may shift a little bit, the needs may shift as you move from the initial crisis. In April, like you said, human health is paramount, and you think about communications, and you start to think about containment, and then as you think about in a latter stage, the eventual remediation and restoration of the environment that's been damaged by an accident, your data needs may shift a little bit. And if you can appreciate these different stages of the crisis and the essential data needs, Scott, in each element of the crisis, you can be really prepared and avoid the "I don't know" answer to difficult questions that the public or the regulatory community may ask you. What is happening downstream? What is happening in the groundwater? Heaven forbid you don't want to be saying, "I don't know." what does background look like? You don't want to be saying, I don't know. So Scott, Scott, yes. As we think about data collection, even in some of the early stages, you really want to think about these different, the sequence of the crisis and how it evolves over time, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And a critical role for a your vendor network, whoever they are, when you have them involved in it, and say it has shifted from a human health concern to more of a long-term restoration or remediation, ecological event, you really need to have the right decision makers in the room with the right data to, because what can happen is if you do bring in a large network of various strangers, as someone put it earlier, there will be some pull to go off on tangents, and you've really got to have the right people in the room to say, no, that's not important. This is important, and be able to focus that energy on collecting the right data. Because if you're doing soils work and you're doing groundwater work and you're doing, say, sediment or veg, those all take different people and different teams and different expertise. And you've only got so much of that. So you really do have to be able to just focus on what's critically important to getting that project to a point where everyone's comfortable that the environment's been protected and you can close that out. Because otherwise they can drag on for 5, 10, even longer number of years. They can be quite long-term and cost a lot of money.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you completely, Scott. Well said. Yeah.
Yeah, we talk about what constitutes good data. Things like timestamps and coordinates and things like that. And sometimes we don't, or we fail to discuss fully what constitutes bad data, because what we have is an event happening in someone's neighborhood, and people want to volunteer. They want to help. Like, how can I help? And people climb out of the woodwork and they want to be part of the response. They would be part of this opportunity to do something good and positive. And so people are showing up at the command post with just mayonnaise jars full of who knows what, going, hey, I collected the sample at the creek. And you're like, all right, I need you to put that over there. That's not going to be helpful. And just having that understanding that, there may be some academia and folks that want to run on a tangent, like you said, Scott, that, hey, let's start doing aquatic surveys and see how many mussels are in the water. And it's like, well, that's not really part and parcel to what we have going on in this other side of the river. But and so, people wanting to pull you on tangents, and then of course the volunteer element, and people wanting to bring and introduce poor data. And the problem with some people just wanting to accept it all is, once you've accepted it, it's now part of the data record, and you're going to have to explain what all these goofy anomalies are within your data set. So, putting that data management plan, I forget who mentioned it, it's critical to put a data management plan together. I feel it's more so now than it had been, less of a focus in the past. And it's certainly something we need to focus on, putting an understanding about how we're going to manage and report that data and maintain it forever and ever. Amen. So
I'm glad you brought up the bad data part, James, because yeah, that can be a real headache come at the end of the day, trying to explain the ways that maybe a sample was collected, or why it was collected, or that's that mayonnaise jar full of whatever is in it, right?
yeah.
So
Dallas, you had a question earlier about communication. If we could go back real quick, because I think we
for sure.
we missed an opportunity there to talk about.
Yeah, I think we should.
Find when we communicate data, a lot of organizations want to do a town hall, right? You put somebody on a podium in front of a room full of agitated, somewhat confused, angry, hurt, whatever emotion is running through their body. They are there, and it becomes a mob mentality. And we have found one of the lessons learned from many, many opportunities of communicating data and communicating what we're doing is to remove some of that high stress environment. And instead of having a single town hall where it's an us versus them mentality, it's much more conducive for communication to have what we call an open house format, where you might have a table, and at that table is going to be anybody who wants to have a wildlife question, because you can only get like 7 or 8, 10 people around that table talk about it, but you're not getting the huge mob that can get angry really fast. And maybe you have water issues and you have your SMEs behind the desk. And we found, you really set it up like a conference, if you will, and you're going and people go by and go to various tables, but it reduces the crowd size and the hostilities that could arise from a single venue, So, and that would be something we've witnessed firsthand in the States. And I don't know, Canadians are so much more nice. I don't know that you all have that problem up here, but certainly in the United States, there are pitchforks and beating on tables, and they're looking to get somebody. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I would rather have a bunch of booths and have those subject matter experts at each booth. And then if you did have that air question, maybe that person doesn't care about the, whatever
Sure.
the property, the infrastructure that's being repaired at the time, and they care more about certain other elements. So yeah. Did anyone else have any comments on or anything to add on the communication?
April, do you want to talk about, some of the things that we do when somebody is evacuated and we have an incident that requires homeowners to leave their pets behind, leave their belongings behind, and now we're saying, okay, the emergency's over. You're welcome to go back to your house now, and what we would do to communicate some of that.
Yeah, so I'll tell you that when there is an evacuation order, people are reluctant to leave. They don't want to leave if they can't take their animals. We have to ask them to get all their medication. So there's a lot of planning that goes into leaving a home. And then depending on the state of the neighborhood that's impacted, they may even shut off power to the homes during an evacuation. So if you're gone for a day or if you're gone for 3 days, now we're asking you to come back home. And a lot of times we have to do what's like a home clearance program where we physically walk through someone's home with detection equipment, people that are good crisis communicators that can explain what we're analyzing the indoor air quality for. We might have to air it out. There might be, because of the power outages, there might be spoiled food and things that are contributing to odors inside the home that make people even more reluctant. If they have health issues like asthma or a lady that's pregnant or has young children, they may be even more reluctant to go back home. So we might have to do a lot of communication on the front end to really talk about how safe it is now that we're lifting the evacuation and allowing them to come back. But we will write protocols around cutting electricity back on and airing out the home, changing air filters, all depending on the chemical and the nature of the event. But we will do a lot to help people feel more comfortable about returning home when it's time to.
Thanks, April. Yeah, there's a lot of unseen or things you don't think of during a response. It's we did use the iceberg situation a while ago where you see the emergency, but there's so much more going on behind the scenes, right? And I'm curious as well. We're getting close to the question period here, but maybe one more. Just if we could just talk about is there any other unseen components that come to mind? I know Rick had mentioned a few earlier, but anything else that person needs to think about as they're responding to a release or an emergency?
Thing I would add, Dallas, is after the initial crisis, and again, it's paramount human health. As you begin to think about the environmental consequences of what's happened, an eye towards information that you can glean pre-accident conditions. At some point, we need to restore the environment and repair the damages. What that restoration or repair needs to look like really becomes a function of understanding the environment in which that accident occurs. And unless you're fortunate enough to have a volume of background data that you can look towards, numbers of trees, populations of wildlife, soil quality, water quality, you have to be able to begin to assess that yourself and try and determine what that local background pre-spill condition looks like. And that becomes, again, in the latter stages of this entire incident, something that becomes very important to work with a data manager like Scott in terms of repurposing information you've collected, identifying new data goals and new data needs. That all also has to be very thoughtfully and methodically considered, because that tail end after the accident is under control can be very long, like James says, if you're not thinking appropriately to the types of environments that have been affected and what needs to happen to restore those environments and really restore public trust in your operation, in whatever's happened that's caused the accident.
No, thanks, Rick. Yeah, we are at the question period here, and if anyone has any questions, if they want to type them into the chat, and I know that it'll take a couple minutes maybe to type in the questions. So in that time, I've got. Oh,
maybe I'll ask James too while we
yeah.
have just a minute. What would you say is the true cost of a response? I talked about the emergency phase. Is that the cost? Or Rick, you and James, where's the cost?
It's a good question, right? So it's the understanding that just because the immediate emergency is over, that is, oh, that's the end of it. Rick mentioned the making it whole, right? That's the word we use, is we need to make the environment whole. Well, that could take a long time to understand breeding pairs of some migratory bird and what impact we've done to that population over the next 10, 15 years. It could be the remediation. It could be fines and penalties. In the United States, the largest unanticipated cost of a response is truthfully third-party claims. People suing you. Everybody wants to be a spillionaire. They come out of the woodwork and they want someone to blame and they want you to pay for it. Now, Canadians, again, are much nicer and less litigious, but I think there's also looking across the border and seeing how things are done on one side of the border, and eventually they become adopted on the other side. And so I would say the largest cost, when you're looking at the total cost of a response, is third-party claims, remediation, the natural resources and the damages that you've caused. And that the easiest part, to answer your question in a roundabout way, April, the easiest part is the quantification of how many light plants, how many people I had, how many samples I collected, and all those things. Those are easy. It's all the other stuff that you may not even be considering. For example, did you have a fire and did you put PFAS on it to put the fire out or to suppress vapors? And now am I dealing with a 10-year remediation project because I needed to protect people as part of my response? And so there's a lot going on when you try to quantify total cost of a response.
Yeah, thanks, James and April. So we do have a question here. So thank you for the great webinar. Are there any plans for future webinars focusing on recovery and mitigation? And yeah, I mean, there definitely are. We do several of these types of webinars, and they have different types of focuses a lot of times. But yeah, we're definitely going to come back to emergency response, and yeah, maybe this one is focusing on specifically recovery and mitigation. So does those who have worked with CTEH have anything to add to that? Or
I would like to see a future webinar on the idea of societal restoration, which is something that we've seen this year. It's not only environmental restoration, but how do we make residents whole again? And I see that being on the horizon, and I think it would be fun to talk about with this group and others that actually deal with true restoration following an event, whether it's a natural disaster event or a chemical related accident.
Thanks, April. You've mentioned a few times responding to releases or emergencies in the United States. What other countries, I guess, have we responded to emergencies at? And I'm curious, how is that different than in maybe Canada or the US?
I'll leave
Think,
that one to James if he wants to take that one. I know he might have a Mexico
Um,
example.
Yeah, I would say it's we are fortunate both in the Canada and the United States to have a good framework, that organizational structure with which we have clear regulatory thou shalt respond in using this format, right? So ICS is the structure that we are going to manage the response. It is an expectation by the government that we are going to manage it that way. We train that way, we practice that way. It allows for communication and things like that. Other countries, unless it is an operator that has made an internal decision because they operate in another part of the world, most countries outside of Canada and the United States don't operate with ICS as a default. And so what we find is responding elsewhere, unless it's an operator, a large international major that says we are going to respond regardless of where we have an incident using ICS, we may not be operating that. So come in with the expectation that you're going to still try to loosely manage the incident with a framework, and it should be based off of ICS, I would say. I did go to China, although we didn't respond. It was a whole bunch of training I did there because it was a completely foreign topic to them. In Mexico, ICS doesn't translate, and the government is the responsible party and the person responsible for cleaning it up. It's almost the fox guarding the hen house situation in Mexico. So it was a little bit more of a challenge from a true consultative perspective, helping and advising them, understanding that this is a different relationship because they don't have the strong structure in place. And I know, Rick, you've responded globally as well. I mean, do you have any thoughts in terms of differences you've seen?
Yeah, the US is a litigious environment. That's what we're sort of known for relative to the rest of the world. So after an incident in the US, we have a prescriptive regulatory process, natural resource damage assessment, which is the government's attempt on behalf of trustees of the environment to repair and to make the public whole for the loss of services or the loss of environmental use and assets, fish resources that are affected, trees, et cetera, soils. That process could also be accompanied by third-party litigation, as you said, James, right? Folks that feel that the injuries to themselves are in addition to or to the damages that the government might be thinking about on behalf of the public generally from a spill. Europe has an environmental liabilities directive, a little less litigious, but the game plan is still the same, to make the public whole for the environmental damage caused by an accident. The other countries have similar but maybe far less developed programs for evaluating the injuries to the environment and then adding a value to those injuries that the responsible party would have to then pay to help restore the environment. I think Canada has a ship source oil pollution fund that's emerging. So when we think about oil pollution, it's a little different than what we're thinking about with industrial accidents, but the same basic premise still holds. The public, from a governmental perspective, wants to be made whole for the damages that have occurred. Whether everybody's going to go to the US model, which is very well developed, I don't think necessarily that's going to happen. But I think the best avenue for companies involved in accidents is to take the bull by the horns and to show some leadership in terms of the cleanup and the restoration work that needs to be done, as opposed to sitting back and waiting for lawsuits or waiting for the government to tell you what to do. I don't think that's a great course of action in the future.
And I think globally, I mean, a company's reputation is at the forefront. So it doesn't matter where you operate. It'll be in the news and it could affect your reputation in other countries. So
Well said. Absolutely, April.
Yeah, Rick, and to that point, like in my experience anyway, taking the bull by the horns approach is actually the more cost-effective approach long term as well, in my experience.
yeah, some call it prudently over respond. You can always turn people around. You can always demote personnel, but if you can really attack it on the front end, then it could save time and money in the long term.
Yeah. But I think April and Scott, James, in that framework, you really need a strong set of individuals that are there to help you through a crisis from day one through the end. God forbid, a long process that might happen. And that's because, James, to your point, the public is in crisis as well as a result of an incident. There's not a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of supposition. The news media and social media in general can make great hay out of even the smallest of incidences. So you need strong people who are involved on your behalf in incident command, and in different key positions, including data management, including restoration, including health and ecology. So that, and most importantly, in public communications, it takes a certain individual to express that calm, I'm in control demeanor, isn't it? I mean, you can't underestimate that, because perception is part of the challenge that we're dealing with here in terms of a company's reputation and feeling like something's being done and it's being done right. Would you agree, April?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're a rare breed here in emergency response.
Yeah,
But yeah, you need to know who your trusted partners are ahead of time. Understand personalities. Things can get really crazy. Hair's on fire, if you will. But yeah, a calm demeanor is absolutely part of what you need for response.
yeah,
Yeah, I like the the hitting it hard too at the very start, prudently over respond. That also demonstrates the commitment to dealing with the incident right away and putting all the resources we can at it. And I think you start off on the right foot with the public when you show that you mean business when something happens. Uh, I want to move into, there's not a lot of questions, but I got one more before we wrap up here, and that's in terms of technology. And I'm curious where you see technology taking us in terms of emergency preparedness and response in the coming in the future.
I'll just say that we've developed a robotics program. So we have a robot dog, if you will, along with drone technology. We're able to collect air monitoring data with drones. We can collect samples with drones. The robot dog can evaluate, even using AI technology, to decipher, take a lot of great photos, but mainly get into places that you may not want to send people initially. So that's some of the new technology that's on the horizon that we're working on in our robotics program.
Yeah, I'd say from the surveillance perspective, satellites are becoming much more common. April mentioned drones, and drones can be, the flying ones that you envision, but they can be terrestrial drones as well. We have Teslas and other things that drive by themselves. We have robotic dogs now that can do all that and put people out there. So technology is catching up. We still have areas for improvement. And there are companies that come up with different sensors and things like that. But whether it's LDAR type cameras that can see vapors, and then our other instruments for quantification, they're working hand in glove in that realm. So we're employing the technology and seeking regulatory approval to do more in that front. And so there's always a little skepticism at first, but you'll see people using remote controlled jet skis right? That's a technology that's being evaluated for open water spills. So all sorts of stuff in the technological front.
And Scott, we'd like data tablets for field collection, don't we? That's a huge positive, isn't it, for all
Yep.
of us?
Absolutely. I was
Yeah.
just going to bring that up, and even on iPhones or your Samsung, yeah, building out quick apps just to be able to collect that data digitally and fire it straight into the cloud, into that one source of truth. It's critical because you can imagine in the ICS, you've got all that data coming in. The quicker it's in the actual system, the better. So you can get it through a QA, QC process and get it in the right hands. And on top of that, the other thing too, and James and April touched on it, but anywhere you can incorporate sensors into not just a response, but even into your facilities. And I know our clients are doing a lot of that because we're seeing, you know, things are better on a lot of fronts. You've got methane, but you've also got early detection of pressure drops and the various technologies related to making sure it's not a spill. So the best spill response is not having a spill. So, you know, I think there's a lot of good technology on that front that we're starting to see the benefit from. And people might think, you know, we're in the emergency response business. We want you to have spills. We don't want you to have spills. There's enough events. So, you know, anything you can do to not have the spill, I think is really critical too.
Yeah,
Awesome.
a big decline in spills through process safety management programs. Absolutely. We want to help a lot on the preparedness side.
Certainly. There's actually a couple questions that just came in. One comment. We got 3 minutes, so we'll see how far we get. This is just a comment. Calm is a relative term. I agree. Like the comparison to icebergs, this person's saying that their calm is compared to a duck and looks effortless on the surface, but beneath the surface, there's a lot of activity happening. So they're calm, but there's just the wheels turning. There's a lot going on. So I think that was an important comment. Another one here. Are there any apps? This is on the technology end of things. Are there any apps that would support the communication with the public and sharing data, notices, recommendations, resources for post-disaster? Then they just said that this will greatly support accessibility and transparency without having to rely on social media communication during an incident. So yeah, are there any apps like that we've seen out there? I know there's a few, like our weather network locally in Canada will have like little things come up, air quality warning or so forth. So maybe there's opportunities to partner with those organizations. But yeah, have you come across anything like that?
Here in the Houston area, we do have an app that's used for communication by the facilities. They can communicate when they're doing a turnaround and people may hear some louder noises than usual. They can have increased traffic, so they can communicate that type of information. But also if there's an incident, that's a first spot for them to stick information about the nature of the release and whether or not the public is anticipated to be impacted. They call it the Community Awareness Emergency Response app, and all the local emergency planning committees, LEPCs, use it, and you know, also to communicate with the public. So I think regionally people are doing it, especially in areas that have, you know, a lot of plants in one place. But I use it quite often here for reference when something's going on.
Well, thanks, April. And unless anyone has anything quick to add, we're right at 1 minute to 10. So I'd like to thank everyone for calling in today and joining us for this important discussion. I mean, preparedness, it's always good to talk about it before something happens. And like we were just saying, hopefully it never does. So thanks to everyone, April and James and Rick and Scott for joining us today as well. And we'll see everyone at the next webinar.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the conversation.
care.
Everybody. Appreciate it.